Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I begin in the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful. Dear listeners, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. A very good evening and welcome back to Friday Night Fusion, the new sound of Great Britain, broadcasting live and interactive on 93.5 FM, Unity FM across Birmingham and the surrounding areas, both nationally and internationally on www.unityfm.net. And of course, you can hear the show tonight from anywhere around the UK via our wide plethora of media partners. So a very big salam to each and every one of you, no matter where you're listening to us from right now. As you know, throughout the month of March, we here on Friday Night Fusion have been marking Muslim History Month, looking back at the history of the Muslim community. Who are we? Where did we come from? What successes can we talk about? How can we ensure that people who perhaps grow up in the UK feel a greater sense of connection to our country? Last week, of course, we were in conversation with a number of historians regarding the Muslim history walks taking place in London, finding out about Islam's connection to the United Kingdom. But today we want to take more of an international angle. In fact, we want to go back through history a few centuries to the time of the Crusades. I'm sure many of you have heard of them. They played a specific role and are remembered quite clearly for the fact that you saw many people coming together, fighting under religious grounds sometimes, but also for political reasons, for that sense of dominance that we've always heard about in history. The East versus the West, some may describe it, but of course, just like any time in history, nothing is so simple. But to talk about this issue further with me, I'm happy to say that joining me on the line, I have an internationally renowned historian, somebody who has worked extensively in this particular field, has looked at the Crusades in great detail, and he joins me live from the United States of America. Brother Firas Alkhateeb is a teacher of Islamic history and also focuses his work on American and global history as well. Assalamu alaikum, Brother Firas. Jazakallah khair. Thank you very much for joining us all the way from the US of A on Friday Night Fusion tonight.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'm very pleased and honored to be with you.
First and foremost, brother, before we delve into the period in which we saw the Crusades and later in the show Muslim Spain, what inspired you to become a historian?
Well, I've always been interested in this kind of stuff since when I was a young kid, but really it was when I got to college and I realized that as Muslims living in the West, we can study, the history of World War II, we can study the history of Asia, we can study the history of America, we can do all that kind of stuff. But the difference with Islamic history is that it's so far been written by people who are not Muslim. If you were to pick up the leading books on Islamic history, books like The Venture of Islam, which is a wonderful 3-part book, it's written by a non-Muslim. And most of our books are like that in the past few hundred years since the decline of Islamic thought. So I felt like we needed more people to really dive into the field of Islamic history from the Muslim perspective and to understand it on our own terms instead of having other people explain it to us.
Now, the Crusades, it was, of course, a very memorable time in history. It saw the great dominance of Islam in particular. It saw many successes for the Muslim community at the time, not only in the East, but also as time went on towards the West. How would you best describe the Crusades? Was it a time where you had two religious pieces of ideology fighting against each other for dominance, or is it far more complex than that?
Oh, of course, it's a lot more complex than just that. In fact, if you look at the original causes of the Crusades, you're talking about really a conflict between the eastern and western parts of the Christian world. The Crusades themselves started when the Byzantine Emperor Alexios asked the Catholics in Rome for help defeating the Turks in Anatolia. And the Catholics kind of took an approach to it, which was political and religious at the same time, but Muslims were kind of an afterthought when it came to the causes for the Crusades. They really wanted to kind of get an upper hand over other Christians, which is just a political conflict, really, between different groups of Christians in Europe. So when you're talking about, what type of conflict were the Crusades, a lot of people try to show it as a clash of civilizations, Islam versus Christianity, East versus West. But there's a lot more nuances in it than just that. There's not, one big alliance of Muslims versus Christians. It's very, very complex and very complex alliances going back and forth. And it's a very difficult time period to quantify in such simple terms such as East versus West or clash of civilizations.
Now, the Crusades themselves featured many different battles, many different actors as well, and different leaders who very much gained prominence during this time. What would you say were the main motivations for these countries, for these armies to engage in what were sometimes highly costly wars in many different ways?
Well, from the European perspective, it was seen as an act of chivalry and of honor. If you were a European knight who had gone to the Holy Land and had killed infidels, in their view, Muslims, then you were seen as being one of the most honorable and chivalrous knights in Europe. So for them, it was kind of seen as an expedition for many of the knights who joined in Europe, an expedition to kind of prove their worth. And then on the other hand, you've got the Muslim perspective, where the Muslims also are kind of looking at it in the same way, but there is a little bit more of a religious tint from the Muslim perspective. Because from the Muslim perspective, this is Muslim land that had been occupied. It is Muslim land that had been taken from them after a great, golden age of Islam that lasted from the 700s to really until the 12th century. And for the Muslims, it was kind of a fight to prove their supremacy, that we had kind of created this great world-spanning civilization, and we weren't going to be defeated by these, barbarians coming in from Europe.
When the decisions were taken to engage in such battles and in such wars, were the soldiers on both sides and the fighters on both sides driven by similar objectives? Was there a sense of what we often see nowadays as nationalistic pride of country, something that we often refer to in the UK when we talk about our own army nowadays, is pride of Queen and country, fighting for Queen and country? Was that the main focus of a lot of these soldiers, or were their objectives far more religious than secular?
No, when you're looking at world history, you have to keep in mind that the idea of nationalism is a very, very new concept. It really was born in the mid-1800s, and now is the main way that people identify themselves. I'm an American, or I'm, from Britain, or I'm German, or I'm, Egyptian, or whatever it might be. But at that time, the idea of nationalism still had not taken root anywhere in Europe or in the Middle East. So when we're talking about the motivations of the individuals, in a lot of cases, it was simply, if you're a career soldier, that's just what your job is. You serve the Sultan, or you serve the king if you are a knight in Europe. And whatever the king decides, if the king decides we're going to go to war, that's your job, and you're going to fulfill your duties as best you can, the same way that, an office worker would fulfill his duties the best he can, or a teacher fulfills his duties to the best that he can. So it really wasn't an idea of nationalism. But when we're talking about the greater causes, what brought people to actually go to war, was much more religious than secular. We have to keep in mind that this is a time period when religion plays a huge role in the lives of both Christians and Muslims. It's not like that today, particularly in the West, but at that time you defined yourself according to your religion. You did not define yourself according to your nationality, not Syrian or Egyptian or English or whatever it might be.
Nowadays, in 2013, we often talk about the Muslim community as a community who very much faces hardships, whether it's here in the United Kingdom, in the United States where you are, or anywhere around the Western world. In fact, we're constantly seeing Islam and Muslims being used in the same sentence as terrorists, extremists and fundamentalists. Not a pleasant situation to be in. However, when we look back to the time of the Crusades, what position were the Muslim in and the Muslim community in those days?
Oh, if we're comparing today to back then, it might be very difficult for us to fathom, but it was much, much worse at that time. I mean, today, especially when we're looking at the Crusades, we can make an analogy between the 1100s when Masjid al-Aqsa, when Jerusalem was occupied by non-Muslims, and say, oh, well, it's very similar to that today. The difference is that back then, when the Crusaders, for example, first entered into Jerusalem in the year 1099, they entered and they killed every single living being in that city, whether they were Muslim or Muslim or Jew, and there are some reports of Christians also being massacred. And we're talking 70,000 people within 1 week that were massacred, and even if the Crusader sources say that the blood of the Muslims reached up to their knees in Masjid al-Aqsa. We don't have anything like that today, alhamdulillah. So when we're comparing, the Crusades to the modern day Muslim Ummah, we have to understand that as bad as it is now, it has been much worse in the past. And one of the great lessons that I enjoy teaching about the Crusades is that if we're looking at the Muslim world today and saying, oh my God, the Muslims are in such a bad position and the Ummah is disunited and this and that, well, we have had much, much worse times, and we have risen from those times as well. So if we have risen from times like the Crusades, and we had certainly another golden age after the Crusades, it is certainly possible for the Muslim Ummah to rise from our current sorry state as well.
Now, of course, the success of any army, any country, is usually down to the type of leadership their commander shows. Talk to me a bit about Salahuddin Ayyubi, somebody that we hear about on a regular basis whenever you go around the streets of Birmingham or any other city, in fact, around the world that is populated by Muslims. One of the most popular names that people choose to call their children is Salahuddin. But who was Salahuddin Ayyubi?
Yeah, you're entirely right that he is an incredibly popular individual, and even when we look at Christian sources, what they say about Salahuddin is also incredibly, for what they're saying about a Muslim is very, very kind, and they respected him a lot. I mean, he was a very, very respectable type of person, and from a young age, his father had kind of instilled in him this love for Islam. Unlike some other sultans in that time period, and this is probably part of what brought about the Crusades, a lot of the other sultans and the emirs at that time were very much focused on, worldly pleasures. How can I, get the nicest palace? How can I have the most gold? Yada, yada, yada. But with Salahuddin, we see a completely different type of character, and he really does exemplify what a Muslim leader should live like. In fact, there's many stories, of course, of his personality and what type of leader he was. But one that really sticks out to me is that he was known to have never laughed openly. So people are sitting around, they're having dinner, whatever it might be. People tell jokes, and he would always stay stone-faced. He would never ever crack a smile or laugh or anything like that. And when people finally told him, Salahuddin, what's wrong with you? Why have you? We've never in our years and years of service, you've seen you laugh. And his response was that, how am I supposed to laugh when Masjid al-Aqsa, the third holiest site in Islam, is under occupation and there is no salah there? Right? So that's the type of guy that we're talking about right now. We're not talking about somebody that can be compared to today's leaders, who certainly would not be of that type of character. I mean, he was of such, high self-respect and things like that for himself that we can't really even compare him to anyone else at that time or even now.
Of course, something that you mentioned there, which is very significant, is that to Salahuddin Ayyubi, his faith, his religion, Islam, his identity as a Muslim played a pivotal role, not only in his personal life, but also in his role as a leader who very much led the Muslims to success on many an occasion. The Crusades themselves, of course, lasted for many hundreds of years, but what would you describe as the most significant battles that took place during that time?
The most significant battles are probably the initial conquest of Jerusalem by the Crusaders in 1099 and the liberation of Jerusalem by Salahuddin in the year 1187, 88 years later. And the reason I think that these are the two most important ones is because when you compare them to each other and the way that the conquered people were treated, like I already said, when the Crusaders entered Jerusalem in 1099, I mean, they massacred everyone in the city. The blood was to the knees of the knights, and Salah was completely banned there. And the only people that were allowed into the city were Christians. Jews and Muslims were completely excluded. The Masjid al-Aqsa itself was turned into a palace for the Crusader kings. And then when you compare that to Salahuddin's liberation of Jerusalem in 1187, many of his advisors were suggesting that he should do the same thing in return. That, hey, you guys punished us horribly, killed about 70,000 Muslims when you took it 88 years ago, and now we are going to do the same thing to you. Salahuddin actually took the approach of, no, actually Islamically we're not supposed to do that. That's not according to the Islamic rules of war. And he told the Crusaders that they are allowed to leave as long as they paid a ransom. And whoever couldn't afford that ransom, Salahuddin actually covered it for them. So he basically let everyone leave the city with whatever possessions they could take with them. So again, a lot of his advisors were shocked that these people that they have been fighting against now are carrying these treasures and treasures and treasures out of the city. And they're saying, didn't we fight for the city? Don't we deserve something out of it? Well, Salahuddin basically lets these people go with their lives, their property, everything, which is very, very different from what happened 88 years previously when the city was conquered by the Christians.
And that in itself was a truly admirable act on the part of Salahuddin. And something else that I know has been widely documented about the character of Salahuddin Ayyubi is that he also had a mutual respect for those he was even fighting against. Talk to me a bit about that, because that seems rather unbelievable nowadays. Whenever we look at an enemy, they are, for all intents purposes, an enemy. How can you ever have any sense of respect, compassion, understanding with the people you are fighting against?
Yeah, and that's something that's incredibly fascinating when you're studying this time period, is especially the relationship between Salahuddin and Richard the Lionheart of England. Richard launched another crusade after Salahuddin had liberated the city to recapture it for the Christians. So he comes with a huge alliance of Europeans coming in and fighting in the coastal cities of Palestine, cities like Akka and cities like Jaffa. And they are fighting back and forth. They fight these battles, and Richard stays in the Holy Land for a few years. And during this time, the relationship between Salahuddin and Richard is incredible. There are many stories of Richard. At one point, he was very, very sick. So Salahuddin sends his best doctor, who actually was a Jew. His name was Maimonides, and he's known as one of the greatest Jewish philosophers of all time. He sends his greatest doctor to go and help Richard. Now, normally, what you'd want to do to an enemy is to weaken them as much as possible. But this enemy was already weak, and Salahuddin was actually helping nurse him back to health. And he gave him his best doctor. He gave him a bowl of fruits and some snow that they had collected from a mountain and kept it in ice box. You would never see anything like that today. I mean, the chivalry between them, and this is why Salahuddin is seen as such a great character, even in European history, is the chivalry that he showed and the honor and the respect that he had for his enemies. And he still accepted that, okay, we are fighting against these people, and we are still trying to defeat them, but that doesn't mean that we have to dehumanize them and put them down and kick them while they're down and things like that. I mean, the relationship between them, and I can rattle off a bunch of stories that I'm sure that we don't have time for, of the relationship between Salahuddin and Richard, and it's really fascinating, not something that we would ever see today.
What was the motivation behind this type of an attitude that Salahuddin decided to adopt? Why did he feel it was so important to actually help an enemy that could potentially come and harm him in the future? Doesn't it go against the general rules of logic?
It does. It does. To a layman looking at this would say, yeah, this absolutely doesn't make sense. But when you keep in mind Salahuddin's background, the fact that he was educated in the Quran and the Hadith from a very young age, so he's kind of, he's surrounded by this type of atmosphere throughout his life, so that when he actually is in a position to make these decisions, where he turns is the Quran and the Sunnah. And the Quran and Sunnah very clearly lays out the etiquette of war, kind of, and how to treat enemies and things like that. For example, Abu Bakr when he was the Khalifa, after Prophet Muhammad ﷺ passed away, he gave an army that was going to Syria to fight against the Byzantines a very, very strict set of rules. And among these rules are obvious things like don't kill women and children and old people. But some of the rules were very, very strict, even to the point that the army was not allowed to cut down trees that they found on their way. So Salahuddin is surrounded by this type of mentality about how war should be fought. So the best guess that I can have, jumping into Salahuddin's brain of why he decided to fight with such rules set on himself and why he fought against Richard with such respect and even helping his enemy in some cases, is because he was trying to live up to what Islam expects out of leaders. And he was very, very hard on himself in doing so and tried very, very hard to stick as closely as possible to the Islamic rules.
We look back at the time of the Crusades, we look back on people like Salahuddin Ayyubi, of course, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, the greatest man that has ever lived, and some of the great Sahaba Ikram, the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be pleased with them all. And we just look at the way in which they reacted to those who wanted to cause so much harm to them, yet all they showed to these individuals and these groups was love, compassion, mercy and peace. You just talked there about how Salahuddin was able to take over the Holy Land, but even though he was able to do that, even though it was very true that those individuals had caused his people so much harm only a few years before, he still did not agree to or indeed consider that fighting back or retaliating or punishing them would actually be an option. What happened after that point then, Brother Firas? So the Holy Lands are actually regained. Salahuddin is very much a victor in this particular equation. How does history form from that point on?
Well, it's very interesting to look at Islamic history as a cycle. Because what we see over and over and over again throughout Islamic history is that empires rise, like, for example, the empire of Salahuddin, under the leadership of great people, like Salahuddin, or we can say like the Khulafa al-Rashidin, the first four Khalifas, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali, may Allah be pleased with them. And what happens is that over time, the successor generations don't live up to that same level of leadership that their predecessors had set. For example, Ibn Khaldun, who was a great Muslim historian from the 1300s, wrote on this topic in particular, and he said that empires generally last 3 generations. And he said the first generation is always people who lived a very hard life. Even the Sultan himself would live a very, very hard life because they are the ones who are establishing the empire. So they don't have palaces, they don't have all the luxuries of being in power and everything like that. So they are going to be very, simple leaders. They're going to be very religious leaders generally. And then the second generation, which was born in the palace and is used to that luxury, they're still going to kind of hold on to what their fathers did. They're still going to hold on to a little bit of that mentality, but they're going to start to slip a little bit. They're going to start to pay more attention to luxuries as opposed to being a fair and just ruler. And then the third generation, according to Ibn Khaldun, is a generation where everything just falls apart, where this generation has, them and their fathers have been born into luxury. They don't care anything. They don't care about anything outside of the palace. So they're just so, focused on their luxury that they're not going to be very good rulers. And then that empire falls and then a new one rises, according to the cycle that Ibn Khaldun lays out. And that's kind of what happens with the empire of Salahuddin. He was a great and just ruler. His son ruled as a good ruler. He wasn't as great as Salahuddin. And then a couple of generations down the line, his descendants are corrupt, despots that rule over the dominion in a very unjust way. And then the empire falls and a new one rises.
A very interesting analysis there, and something that clearly shows us that this idea that power, money, fortune somehow brings you happiness, brings you the respect of others, brings you successes in every form is pretty much a nonsense, because Salahuddin, I think it's fair to say, and I'm sure you'd probably agree, the strongest thing that he had that drove him forward was perhaps his faith.
Oh, definitely, absolutely. I mean, that's more than anything. He made very clear that his fight for the Holy Land was not a fight for power. In fact, he was actually very reluctant to take power. He actually became Sultan by accident. It was his uncle who had become the Sultan of Egypt, and when his uncle died, everyone was kind of looking around and saying, okay, who's going to take power? And they figured, hey, Yusuf, that was his actual given name, we want you to take power. And then people would start to call him Salahuddin, the righteousness of the religion was his nickname. But he himself never really wanted that type of a lifestyle. He had a very different type of goal for himself. He wanted to study Islam. He probably wanted to be more along the lines of a sheikh than a leader.
A very inspirational leader indeed. We are going to take a short break, Brother Firas, but inshallah we'll be back in a few moments' time actually talking about another successful time in Muslim history, talking specifically about Spain and some of the cultural and traditional successes that we see in Spain that very much live on today. Inshallah, dear listeners, we'll be back after this, still in conversation with Brother Firas Alkhateeb.